So in the previous modules, we've been talking about how to maximize your peer review score. And I want to go back and talk a little bit about how you can find how the FOA that you're applying for will be scored by the peer review so that you can do a little bit more planning upfront on how you're going to allocate the pages of your application to maximize your score. So let's talk a little bit more about that topic. So we're going to talk about how to identify the scoring guide in the solicitation you're applying for, and then understand how to use that scoring guide to your advantage. So almost all federal grants tell you exactly how the application will be scored, and you can identify that information and then put all of your effort towards the scoring. I'll give you an example of where I think a lot of applicants make a mistake and misunderstand how the process works. I've seen a lot of applicants spend a significant amount of time gathering letters of support from their congressional representatives, believing that that will result in them being funded. In reality, the points associated with a letter of support from congressional representatives is zero. And I've not personally seen those letters impact whether someone did or didn't receive a grant. It is really all about the scores. If something isn't worth anything in terms of points, it really should not be your priority. One exception is if the grant did require an actual letter of support from a specific entity, then you want to spend your time there. But in general, the amount of time you should spend on gathering those kinds of letters is really none. So spend your time where it counts. So in the resource section, I have given you samples of two previous FOAs from the FY 2020 season that I'd like you to pull out for the next couple of slides. So you may want to pause the recording if you didn't pull them out in advance. And we're going to look first at the scoring that was associated with the FY 2020 Treatment, Recovery, and Workforce Support Grant. And if you look on page 18, that is where it begins telling you the questions you have to answer, but also how many points are associated with that particular section of questions. Now, in this particular solicitation, they were quite kind and gave you a suggested number of pages. That's pretty unusual. Most of the FOAs are not going to tell you how many pages you should allocate to each section. This one happened to. And so you can see that section A has two questions worth 10 points, and they are suggesting or recommending approximately 1 page be dedicated to those two questions, and so on. So if you step back and look at the 30,000 foot on this particular FOA, there were 10 pages total. They were single spaced, I believe. And I've detailed out all of the scoring for each of the 5 scored sections. In this particular FOA, the budget is not worth anything related to scoring. And it's also not included in the page limits. And so we can see the percent of score allocated to the 5 scored sections, and then the recommended page allocation out of 10 pages. These are just guidelines, but I do recommend that you really think about your pages in this way and ensure that the section that's worth the most points gets the most real estate in terms of your overall program narrative, which is the scored section of your application. Looking at a different FOA just for comparison, I'd like you to open up the FY 2020 Correctional Adult Reentry Education, Employment, and Recidivism Reduction Strategies program. And if you flip ahead to page 12, the scoring details begin there. And you can see they have not given you page allocations here. I believe this particular FOA requires 20 pages double spaced, and that's your max of space that you have available. And you can see this first section is worth 10% of your overall score. The next section is worth 40%. When we look at that in totality, there were 5 scored sections available in this particular FOA. The points weigh heavily on the project design and implementation. 40% of your overall score is going to come from that section. So when you think about dividing up your 20 pages, you want something close to half to be allocated to that particular section. and then the remaining spread out across. Now this, in comparison to the previous sample we looked at, the budget is scored in this particular solicitation. It's worth 10% of your score. And there's not a page limit. The budget is not included in the 20-page limit. So you have as much space as you want, and it's worth 10% of your score. So you do want to make sure that your budget narrative is detailed and aligns with the content that we'll go over in the budget module, and that it is thorough in its description, as we'll describe it again in that budget module. So that's just a quick comparison of two different grants, two different scoring matrices, and how you want to think about your pages and align the page allocation to your scoring. Again, it makes a difference in the end.